So let's look at a sort of very quick history of markup languages, and that'll lead us into a discussion of why we are, what the HTML is that we're going to use on this particular course. So we've been playing around with HTML a little bit, but there are all sorts of markup languages out there, and there's a few examples here: MathML, XHTML, things like that. In fact, markup languages are so popular that a few years ago, Microsoft decided that they were going to change the way that information was stored in the Office suite. And so Microsoft created Office XML. And you may have noticed that the file extension for example, Word documents changed. It used to be .doc, and now it's docx. What that's suggesting is that the file is now being saved in this markup language. So there's loads of different markup languages out there, and there are two special ones on here that aren't exactly markup languages, but I'll talk about XML and SGML in a minute. So markup languages are basically made up. So here are two that I did actually make up. Let's imagine that we had a markup language that was going to be used by, I don't know, estate agents. So the top one, house markup language, and it's got information about houses and whether they're detached or semi-detached and the address and number of bedrooms. And you can see that markup languages use that style, that notation that we've seen in HTML. So that the use of less than and greater than symbols to indicate an element. We've got a label inside there like house and type. We've got attributes. Let's have a look at a different one that I've made up called module, a markup language, and this could be a description of a module that we actually teach. So for example, here is a module called Information Technology for Business, BB1754, and you can see the courses that it's actually offered on, something like that. So you can see that the markup languages are a very common, familiar way of marking data up so that it's reusable. So how do we end up here? Well, a few years ago, when it came to how do we store information, there were really two different choices. We could store information in binary files, which here I've used a sort of splatter pattern to represent a combination of zeros and ones, or plain text files. And it would, the software package that you were using, the company that had originated the software package, they would make a choice about how the information would be saved, what file format you would be using. Would it be a binary file or would it be a plain text file? Now, binary files, to an extent, they were more efficient. They were often proprietary. Only the company would know the sort of secret source, the secret of how to actually save information in that file format. And, there was an argument, well, it's our secret, we can patent it, only we can have it. One of the questions about binary files in that format is, are those files sustainable? What happens if the company goes bankrupt or goes out of business or simply doesn't support that product any longer? There are advantages to plain text files. They're readable, they're writable by any text editor. Obviously the information in there is visible, and there is an argument that that information is maintainable to an extent because we can read it in different bits of software because it is basically just a text file. Here's an example from history of what happens when things go wrong. The moon landing data was saved using these specific special hardware drives with information that was saved on tape, and it was binary information. And so gradually over time machines broke down, were thrown away, and all the information that was held on those binary tapes was locked in on that file format. So it was effectively lost. But actually what happened was, when the call went out, a sort of retired engineer said, actually, I think I've got one of those tape drives in my garage, and they actually found he did actually have one, and they managed to get it working. They put the drives in, and they actually managed to recover some of the images from the moon landing. So there are advantages to having a more open file format where we know that there is no secret source to how information is being saved, that the idea that it's worthwhile thinking about, is it a maintainable data file format? Now, markup languages then have turned out to be a way to overcome these issues because the information is actually saved in plain text. Now, there are two special markup languages, SGML and XML, and these are markup languages which are used to describe other markup languages. And the language that's actually used is we say something is an application of one of these markup languages. So a brief potted history. SGML was the first one that came around, first draft around 1980, and very popular in the law and science areas. The thing about SGML is it's a very loose specification of a markup language, so lots of choices. I think that's probably to do with the history of the documents that were being marked up, law documents which would come in a variety of different forms. XML was a more recent markup language, and that was created by computer scientists with the intention that it would be very precise. It's a very small document, very formal, can fit in a tiny book. So SGML and XML were, if you like, the grandparents of markup languages that have come about. So when Tim Berners-Lee was creating HTML, and the first draft was around 1991, he lent heavily on some of the notions that were in SGML, because of course that predates XML. And there were various different versions of HTML, and you can see them here. And of course, as the versions progressed, more and more features were sort of added in over time. And it became quite messy because lots of attributes, lots of elements were being added in, and there was a sort of tussle going on between who controlled the standard. Was it the W3C? Was it the browser manufacturers? Of course, without having support for the features that were being added into HTML, it wouldn't matter what the standard documents said. If the browser didn't support a feature, it simply wouldn't be displayed. If you go back to the original document, by the way, the original HTML version, and here are some screenshots of it, you can see some of the tags are exactly what we have right now. So, for example, HTML, head, title, body, things like that. And you can see that there are some structural elements here like headings, italics, paragraph. So all of those items are still carried forward today. Here's an example of HTML document from that original standard, and you can see everything that's in there looks very similar to the way that we would mark up an HTML document right now. Now, because HTML is an application of SGML, and SGML-ish was quite a loosely specified, quite loose, so case wasn't important. You could put things in uppercase or lowercase. You didn't have to put closing tags in. Sometimes attributes didn't need quotes. And HTML progressed and different features were added in until we hit sort of peak HTML, which was version 4, to try and sort of consolidate all the different versions and all the different ideas of HTML. HTML4 came in 4 different flavors, 3 different flavors. You would have strict, transitional, and frame set. And the idea here was that when you were creating an HTML document, you would say what kind of version of HTML it was, and then the browsers could actually handle that. Because of course, one of the problems that we have here is that there were sort of thousands of millions of websites coded in earlier versions of HTML. So when a new version of HTML came out, there was a decision about, do we support all the old features or do we try and retire some of them? And the way that we would actually specify what kind of HTML we were using is by using this thing called a doc type. And that's a little bit of code that we put at the top of the document specifying, if you like, what version of HTML we were using. So when it came to HTML4, you would have a different header at the top and you would say, was it a transitional version of HTML? Was it a strict? Was it the one that supported a frame set? Now, HTML was an application of SGML-ish, but of course, there was this other process that took place, which was, well, XML came into existence. Why not create a version of HTML, which is an application of XML? One of the problems and criticisms of HTML is it's very loose. It allows you to do all these things in different ways. Why not create a far more formal version of HTML for markup languages? So XHTML was a version that was created in XML. And of course, one of the consequences of it being written in XML, an application of XML, is that it was far more formal. So that meant things like tags had to be in lowercase, and you had to put closing tags on things. So here you can see a closing paragraph tag, and we'd have to close empty elements properly. So that's where we see the / coming in like that. Tags would have to be nested correctly, so you wouldn't be able to do something like this: bold, italic, close bold, close italic. You'd have to do it the right way around. And all attributes would have to be in quotes, so it would have to look something like this. And of course, there would be a special heading required at the top of the document to indicate that you were using XHTML. Now, of course, what happened was XHTML turned out to be not that popular with browser manufacturers because it was very strict. And one of the problems with it being very strict was that it would break previous pages. So over time, there's a lot of discussion about the different people who were taking control of the markup language syntax. And after a while, they settled on this idea that they should come together and they should have a new version of HTML, HTML5. So HTML5 is, if you like, where we ended up from the different roots from XHTML and HTML derived from SGML. So HTML5, now in fact, they've actually discarded the notion of calling it 5, they just call it HTML. And the whole idea here is, rather than having all those presentational attributes which were in the original HTML standard, we'll use CSS for design. So what we're going to do on this course is we will use HTML5, or rather HTML, but we will use it in a semantic way. Now, by that, I mean we will use only a part of HTML, and really the part of HTML we'll be using will be the bit which is used for specifying structure. In other words, we're describing the actual content of the HTML, not the presentation of the style, because that will be done in CSS. So in a way, we can actually divide the tags that are available into sort of good tags and bad tags. The tags that we're not going to use are the ones which are to do with styling. So font color, if we're aligning, using setting fonts, things like that. All that stuff is available in HTML to be backwards compatible, but we won't be using any of those tags. We'll be doing it all in CSS. The good tags, the ones that we've been using anyway, to do with structure, to do with headings, paragraphs, things like that. So these are the tags that we've been using: head, title, body, headings, paragraphs, anchor tags, image tags, and some other things to do with ordered lists and tables and things like that. Now, of course, what's key is to indicate what kind of document, what kind of markup we'll be using. And in this instance, of course, we're using HTML5, or HTML as it's called. So thankfully, what's nice and simple about that is we can do that with a really straightforward doc type that says this: doc type HTML.